Are you free to choose the right thing, or is your behavior genetically predetermined? And while we're at it, what does right and wrong really mean anyway? You know, we live in an age when the idea of anything being truly right and wrong is open to question. But if you're the one who's been wronged, or an injustice has been perpetrated against you, well, then you know that this is not simply an academic question.
The thesis of the lecture today is that the existence of God provides the only coherent explanation of the necessary conditions of there being an objective morality. Only if you believe in God can you give a sensible account of what it means for something to be right and wrong. And the actions of all people reveal that they presuppose that there is an objective moral code. And therefore, only the presupposition that God exists allows people to live consistently within their stated philosophy. So what a presuppositional argument does is it says, hey, we're going to presuppose God exists, and in so doing, our actions and our beliefs will come into coherence, into agreement. And if we don't have that belief in God, we are going to be walking, talking contradictions. There's a philosopher named Voltaire who kind of captured the spirit of this type of reasoning. He said that if God did not exist, we should have to invent him. And what he meant by that is that there are so many things in the world around us that we can't explain except in light of the existence of God, that even if he didn't exist, we'd have to posit his existence to make sense of our experience. But based on what we've said about the method of multiple competing hypotheses and inferring to the best explanation, if God is the best explanation, that may be because God really exists. So a presuppositional argument for theism purports to show how presupposing theism and the existence of God can best explain why certain necessary human beliefs are true. And one of the things I'm going to argue is that a necessary belief that all of us, one way or another, end up betraying is that we believe there are ethical norms. There are moral codes that really do make a claim on us, that they are objective and that they allow us to say that something is right or wrong. So let's look at, first of all, some of the conditions of there being an objective morality. Okay, here's Fyodor Dostoevsky, famous Russian novelist. He says, if God is dead, then all things are permissible. And what he's saying is kind of what we're saying in this lecture, that God is a necessary condition of there being an objective morality. And here's another way you could think of it. If God is dead, then all things are permissible, but people do not act as though they believe that all things were permissible. Therefore, people are living as though God were not dead. That's another way of thinking of the presuppositional argument for theism. Conditions of moral objectivism, of there being a real and meaningful morality. Well, one of the first is there must be some kind of transcendent standard, some standard above us all to which we can appeal. Let me illustrate with a little syllogism. The basic principle here is that is does not equal ought. Is does not equal ought. Now here's the syllogism. Murder hurts people. Anybody here want to take me on that? Let's have a philosophical rumble over. Okay, we can pretty much all agree that murder hurts people, right? Now here's the conclusion. Therefore, murder is wrong. There's a missing premise there, though, isn't there? What do I need to know from the logical standpoint to get from this statement about murder to the statement that murder is wrong?
Hurting people.
Brilliant. Hurting people is wrong. Ta-da. You got the right answer, okay? But wait a minute. Where did we get this idea, is wrong? This is a fact of the matter. Murder hurts people. Where do we get this concept of wrong? This is a fact, but is wrong, that's an abstraction, isn't it? And it seems to imply that there is some standard that is being violated. If If you say something's wrong, that's as opposed to what? Being right. But who decides what's right and wrong? The idea here is that there's something beyond the factual that's involved in a moral imperative, in a statement of ought or should not. Obviously, if you're a theist, it's possible to give an account of what that standard is. What would we say? God, that's part of it. I mean, God is the source of it. What would...
You wrote it down.
Okay, there's actually there's propositions that have been revealed to man. If you're a religious theist, you think they're revealed in Scripture, right? What's that?
It's his character.
It's a reflection of God's character. There's a school of theistic ethics called virtue ethics, and the idea is that God isn't imposing some arbitrary rules on humanity with the 10 Commandments or something like that, that God's moral injunctions are a reflection not only of his character, but also they reflect how he designed humans, and that by obeying those moral injunctions, we are ensuring that we will function the way he intended. They're kind of like a little book you get when you buy the car, the owner's manual. It's the way to ensure the proper flourishing of a human person. Okay? So they're a reflection of God's design and therefore his love for his creatures. He reveals how you best will function. Okay? So theists have a lot to say about, first of all, where that standard resides, where it comes from, why it is above us all, and something to which we can all appeal. Okay? But notice what happens with some of the other worldviews. How about pantheism? Well, you got a real problem here trying to account for that objective moral standard. In fact, this is one of the biggest problems with the pantheistic worldview. Pantheism asserts that all dualisms are illusions. A dualism is a distinction. The distinction between you and me is ultimately an illusion because the fundamental reality is that mystical oneness of the pantheistic God, and we're all part of that. The distinction between you and me is an illusion. Well, what's that do to morality? What is morality but a distinction between right and wrong? Well, if that's an illusion, no objective ethics, right out of the chute, okay? Also, the pantheistic God does not communicate. And even if that pantheistic God had an idea, well, that can't be because the pantheistic God is not a mind, there'd be no way to communicate it either. So there's no basis for there being an objective moral standard within pantheism. Naturalism, materialism has the same kind of problem, although in our next lesson, we're going to look at some attempts that the materialists have made to give some kind of an account of objective ethics. But generally speaking, most people who hold the materialist or naturalist worldview, including existentialists and nihilists, which are slight variations on that worldview, they end up just admitting that ethics are purely relative. They're merely personal preferences, okay? Because there's nothing beyond the universe to provide that standard. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. Deism is a kind of a hybrid of theism and naturalism. It believes there's a God, but many deists have believed there's an objective moral code. They believe you can reason to it. But there's also some problems we'll see in the deistic worldview of accounting for objective ethics. So one of the conditions of there being a moral objectivism, of there being a meaningful system of ethics, is there's got to be a standard above us all to which we can appeal. Theism can provide an account of that, but other worldviews have difficulty doing so. Another condition of there being moral objectivism is the idea of free will. Now, the principle here is sometimes summarized with this little equation. Ought implies can. If you're going to say somebody ought to have done something, that presupposes that the person could have made the choice to do so. Now, I used to use a really grisly illustration when I was teaching this in the first college where I taught. I had a good friend who was on the same core team with me. He was an English professor. He was much beloved of the students. He was a conservative English professor who wore a crew cut who was also hip. And the students loved him. His name was Vic Bob. He could take a joke, you know. Doesn't he sound conservative? Vic Bob from Eastern Washington. He was from Washington State. So I always made this illustration. I said, imagine that you've gotten tired of all of Vic's hard tests, and so you strap that big belt buckle he wears to the flagpole, and you hoist him up to the top of the flagpole. And then you cut it loose, and on the way down you say, Vic, don't make a mess. He falls, he makes a mess. I mean, it was a bad illustration, but I couldn't think of a better one. Okay, and then you bawl him out. That was so wrong, the way you bled all over the pavement. Okay? We only believe that ethical norms are appropriate to apply when a person has a choice about whether or not they can meet the ethical norm. All right? The worldview of naturalism, in particular, has propagated the idea that we can't help it in all cases, that we have no free will. Here, Stephen Jay Gould says, matter is the ground of all existence. This is a statement of the materialistic worldview. Mind, spirit, and God as well are just words that express the wondrous results of neuronal complexity. Another similar idea from another Darwinian biologist, human free will is non-existent. Free will is a disastrous and mean social myth. We're completely determined by our genes and our environment and what the evolutionary process programmed into us. Here's another evolutionary biologist, also a committed scientific materialist, Michael Ruse and his colleague E.O. Wilson. Morality is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive end. In an important sense, ethics, as we understand it, is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes. This is naturalism or materialism 101. The things that are really real in the universe are matter and energy, and the way matter and energy obey the laws of physics. We are composed of matter and energy, and therefore our actions are entirely determined by the interactions of the atoms in our brains or whatever it is. Okay? We saw that from Will Provine, the famous historian of biology, a Darwinian, who says that if you take Darwin seriously, the idea of free will is a complete illusion. And therefore he says, now this is interesting. Then he turns around and says, therefore it's cruel to prosecute people for crimes. And when he says cruel, what is he making?
Objective moral
A moral judgment. I mean, it's so contradictory. And this is where I go back to what I was saying in the opening illustration. It's impossible to live with this philosophy of moral relativism. Will Provine, in the very act of defending moral relativism by saying there is no free will, he turns around and in the next sentence says it's cruel of society to prosecute criminals because they can't help themselves. They have no free will. Well, why don't not say that of society? Society can't help itself either. It's just doing what it was programmed to do. Why call it cruel? It's just doing its thing, baby. And that's one of the reasons that we've gotten this idea that everybody's a victim in our culture. It's all something else's fault. Now, that idea first came into our way of doing law back in the 1920s. You guys have heard of Clarence Darrow? Okay, famous lawyer from Scopes trial. Okay, very good. Okay, 1924, the year before the Scopes trial. Now, many people know this story, but it's a very interesting one. He is sent by the ACLU out to Chicago to defend two guys that are guilty for a murder. No question about the guilt. The two guys are Leopold and Loeb, and Dickie Loeb there is to the left. And these guys were affluent students who were attending the University of Chicago, and they were reading Nietzsche. And their professor was telling them that morality was a myth for the lower classes, and the enlightened needed to declare their freedom from morality. They thought they'd kind of exercise that philosophy, and they went out and they killed a boy just for, quote, the thrill of it. Darrow came out at the point of sentencing and argued for clemency. He said, look, I know they're guilty, I know they did it, but they're not really responsible for their actions, so don't sentence them severely. Don't give them the death penalty, don't do anything like that. Let them off easy. This is the argument that Darrow made. He said, is Dickie Loeb to blame because of the infinite forces that were at work producing him ages before he was born? Is he to blame because his moral machinery is imperfect? He went on to argue that Dickie Loeb sure had defective moral machinery, but that was the result of the long evolutionary history that produced him. That he didn't have any control over this. He was programmed by the evolutionary process to have certain moral instincts, and his were just different than everybody else's, so how could we hold him responsible? The argument was accepted by the judge, and that was the first, we now call it the diminished responsibility plea. But notice the root of the idea. Where does it come from? What's the worldview that made that argument sound credible?
Moral sobriety.
No free will, right? No free will. And why doesn't he have free will?
Because it was already determined with this evolutionary change.
Exactly, exactly. Now, we've got this cool little diagram up here. One of you have drawn for me, okay? And this is a judge here, and this is a noob. I don't know exactly what a noob is. I'm going to need some training in hip terminology. But there was a little cartoon I saw a while back. The caption said, the little noob is saying to the judge, not guilty by reason of millions of years of evolutionary selection for aggressive behavior, Your Honor. Okay. Captures the idea, doesn't it? Okay. This is a cartoon in a major newspaper. This is perking into our culture. We aren't responsible because we don't have any free will, because we're totally determined by genes, environment, and our evolutionary history. Well, that just illustrates the point I'm making, that if you're going to have an objective system of morality, you have to have a reason to think that humans are capable of choice. They can choose between right and wrong. And this is the way Darrow argued it. He said, nature is strong, and she works in her own mysterious ways, and we are all her victims. And you see this idea everywhere. The naturalistic worldview gives rise to the idea that whatever is right. Whatever's natural is good. So you see it with the practice. Newsweek magazine a while back describing some people who were defending the practice of killing not preborn babies, but afterborn babies. Practice of infanticide can no longer be considered abnormal. It's instead as normal as parenting, instincts, sex drive, and self-defense. It's just an instinct. Some people, take care of their babies. Other people kill them. Same thing with sexual ethics. After the Kinsey studies in the 1940s, the Kinsey reports inspired this idea that if it feels good, do it. Okay? Because whatever's natural is good. Instincts to do disgusting things, instincts to do kind things. So the naturalistic worldview leads naturally to a system in which ethics are merely relative. To have a system of objective morals, we really need to have a reason to regard humans as valuable, intrinsically valuable. And I would also add to that, we have to have a reason to regard humans as qualitatively different from other forms of life, whether it be bacteria or lower animals or whatever it is. Because most of morality concerns how we treat other people. And if we don't have a reason to think that people are worth treating well, our whole system of morality evaporates. Now, in a Judeo-Christian framework, in a theistic framework, where we believe that humans are created in the image of God, we have a rationale, a reason to believe that humans should be treated well. Our founders, in the Declaration of Independence, and especially in the way they structured the Constitution, predicated their whole understanding of the protection of human rights based on the idea that humans were endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. The idea of rights derived from the idea that there was an intrinsic dignity for each person. That flowed directly out of a stream of Judeo-Christian thought that said that humans were made in a special way to reflect the unique capacities of the Creator, and therefore they needed to be protected from the abuse of power, for example. Now, in a modern Darwinian context, we have people like Peter Singer, who says humans do not have a special or unique value. He also says, interestingly, that in stating this, he's just applying Darwinian thought to ethics and morality. The life of a newborn baby is of less value than the life of a full-grown pig or dog or chimpanzee. The baby can do less, and since the only way to measure the value of something is by its utility, no qualitative difference between humans and animals in his Darwinian philosophy. And therefore, that philosophy ends up undermining the whole system of ethics that we've long inherited in the West. And it ends up creating a kind of confusion. I think there's a clear distinction between protecting animals and according them rights that we have only accorded to humans. But from a naturalistic and indeed a Darwinian point of view, there is no qualitative difference between humans and animals. So on the one hand, that leads to a kind of sentimentality. And here's the logic of animal rights. We'll call it take one. There is no qualitative difference between humans and animals. Humans have rights. What follows? Animals have rights. In fact, they should have the same rights as humans, logically speaking. Another take on logic of animal rights. Naturalistic ethics, take two. There is no qualitative difference between humans and animals, same premise. We kill animals when it suits our purposes or when they are no longer useful. Therefore, it's permissible to kill humans when it serves our purposes or when they are no longer useful. Anyone in, say, the last 100 years implement this kind of a logic?
Hitler? Not legally.
Well, it was legal in Nazi Germany. If you saw the end of Expelled, a lot of people criticized the movie because there was too much about the Nazis. From an artistic point of view, that might be right. But that story they told about how the Darwinian ideology that came from Darwin and Huxley and then over to Germany with Haeckel and how it influenced the Nazis, and in Mein Kampf, how Hitler was saying, we're going to apply Darwinian logic. We want the survival of the fittest race, and we're going to help the evolutionary process along. Your value is determined by your usefulness to society, and by your rank in Hitler's idea about races. Yeah?
Isn't that kind of the point, though, that different societies have different standards of ethics? So it's kind of supporting relativism? If you look back in time, Americans thought that slavery was okay.
Okay, some Americans in 1850 say slavery is right.
Yeah.
Okay?
And now?
And now, you and I say slavery is wrong. Okay? Does that mean that ethics are relative? No, it means that you and I disagree with them, all right? See, there's a non sequitur. We'll talk about this in the next lecture. We're making a statement about ourselves. I believe X, you believe X, they believe Y. The ethics is not about us, it's about the proper conduct that should be the case. So to say that you and I disagree is not the same thing as saying there is no standard. It would be like saying, you think the atom is made of cheese, I think the atom is made of Jell-O, and because we disagree, the atom doesn't have real properties that are independent of our opinions. Do you see the fallacy? One is a statement about you and me, but what we really want to talk about is ethics itself. Okay, yeah, good. And then you see, this is going to be the problem with naturalism. It leads to two different conclusions, and you can't distinguish. We got one instinct for killing people, another instinct for altruism. Which of those instincts should we indulge? Naturalism can't say. There's no standard, and besides which, we have no choice. I'd like to just get a clip from David Berlinski about this whole idea of what it takes to underwrite a system of ethics that is truly objective, that gives protection to all people.
No system of constraints, short of the religious one, forget about transcendental, short of the religious one, has ever been successful in inhibiting men from doing violence to men. The religious constraints are not necessarily successful, but no system short of religious constraints has ever been remotely successful. And that's a lesson we should take from the 20th century. We know what happened in the 20th century. We know very well. I don't have to recite the entire litany of misery inflicted on the human race in the 20th century in the name of people who said, we're just going to experiment to our heart's content. I mean, that's what the Nazis did. An experiment in eugenics, large-scale experiment in Darwinian theory. That's certainly what the communists did in Russia. It's crystal clear. We're experimenting with the human race. Good for us. It's what the Chinese did. Every society that's done something profoundly repugnant and disgusting has prided itself on the liberation from constraints.
Okay, so here's the argument that we've been making. We've got three key conditions of there being an objective morality. You've got to have an objective standard above us all to which we can appeal that can account for that, the meaning of that word ought. Humans have to have some modicum of free will or choice. They have to be able to choose between competing moral options. And there has to be some reason for regarding humans as having intrinsic value and dignity. So as you look at all the different worldviews and you think, what is necessary for there to be an objective system of ethics? Only theism, and I would assert with David, only really religious theism has provided a sufficient basis for there being an objective ethics. Now, next time what we're going to do is we're going to look at people who say, well, that's a great argument, except there is no objective ethics. Ethics are really just relativistic. And we're also going to look at people who hold a naturalistic view who are going to try to save the idea of objective ethics by bringing in the idea of evolution and using evolution to give an account of morality by saying, hey, evolution has programmed objective ethics into our minds. Okay? So we're going to look at those two challenges to the argument I've just presented.
So morals are all about how we treat each other. You know, Scripture says that we're to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. Could there be any higher standard than that?